Wayne Bowen. He's a professor in the Department of History and interim dean of the College of Undergraduate Studies at the University of Central Florida. Dr. Bowen holds degrees as a Bachelor in Arts in History from the University of Southern California, Master of Strategic Studies from the U.S. Army War College, Master in History from Northwestern University, and a PhD in European History from Northwestern University also. He's an accomplished author with an extensive research on topics related to the history of Spain and by extension to the Ottoman Empire. Some of the notable works, his notable work include the Spanish and the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, Truman, Franco, Spain and the Cold War, a military history of modern Spain, England and the American Civil War, Churchill and Spain. His most recent presentation to our group last year was Three Presidents and the Spanish-American War, Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Truman. He published several books. His latest book is A History of Saudi Arabia, and it came out last November. And he's about to publish another book in the next couple of months or so. It's called Spanish Workers in Nazi Germany. So today, Dr. Bowen will present an exciting lecture titled Foreign Labor in Nazi Germany, Collaborator, Conscripted, and Conquered. Now, before we finish that, I want to also mention what we have for the next, this month actually we have two more presentations. We have club member Steve Bertha will present he will present the history of Central America. And then on March the 31st, we have club member William Colleran will have a fascinating presentation of the race to the moon, a close call, and it will be a fascinating presentation. I will advise everybody to join us for that presentation. So on behalf of the history group of the University Club, my great pleasure to introduce now Professor Wayne Bowen.
It's always fun to be here because when I look out, I see two things I really like. Well, there's a library back there, and then people who enjoy history. So thanks for the invitation to come back. This topic comes out of a book I'm finishing that Dr. Vitas mentioned on Spanish workers in Nazi Germany. This was a group of volunteers who went to the Third Reich during World War II. And so in finishing that book, I've also engaged with the whole broader topic of forced labor and labor in general in Nazi Germany. So this is the outline of what I'm speaking about today. And we will proceed. So there were foreign workers in Germany before the Nazis came to power, for a couple hundred years, actually. If you look at the map, this is the map before the First World War. It's a little bit faded, but hopefully you can see. And what you don't see on this map is the country of Poland. Poland only existed as a country in modern times after the First World War. Before the First World War, it was divided between the German and Russian empires. And so in this context, there were many Poles who worked in German factories, on German farms. Some of them were considered semi-citizens of the German Empire or of Prussia before that. So this employment is not something that was new, but what is new in the Second World War is the scale, the intensity, and of course the violence that accompanied the use of what we would call foreign labor. There was also actions against Poles before the Nazi era. I've got up there, identified expulsions. After Germany was united in 1871, there were many Germans who thought Germany should be only for Germans. And so tens of thousands of Poles were kicked out of the country, even though they and their ancestors had lived there for hundreds of years. So these Poles were forced to move to either Austria-Hungary or to Russia, anywhere but Germany. During the First World War, Germany used forced labor. Many of these were prisoners of war, whether French, British, Russian. Others were forced Poles who were brought back into the country after they had been expelled before. Certainly nothing on the scale of the Second World War, but there certainly was precedent. In fact, many of the German officials during World War II who managed forced labor had gained their first experiences during the First World War. And so they're bringing those experiences back to bear in the Third Reich. You see a picture at the top of Poles engaging in agricultural labor during World War I under German occupation. Of course, Hitler seizes power in 1933, and for the next few years is preparing Germany for war, which begins in 1939 with the invasion of Poland on September 1st of that year. The war in the east against Poland was very quick. Within 3 weeks, Poland had surrendered, and therefore Germany occupied most of Poland. Now, you may remember that before the war, Germany and the Soviet Union had divided Poland. So the invasion in September of 1939 only brought into German power about half of the country. The rest they would take later when they invaded the Soviet Union and the parts of Poland that Stalin had occupied. There were some issues or some challenges that the Nazis faced. Many of those involved their own ideology, the Nazi ideology. One of which was that Hitler came into power promising to make the economy better, promising to make Germany powerful again, promising to overcome not only the Depression, but the suffering that Germany had experienced as a result of losing the First World War, which, after all, they had started. And so he struggled. He refused to give up consumer goods and allotments for families and all of the welfare benefits he introduced. And so instead of focusing on spending for war, he was spending for war as well as making the German population comfortable, happy, and with a high standard of living. What this meant was for much of the Second World War, the Nazis approached the policy not of guns or butter, but of guns and butter. They were still spending on appliances and new homes and money for German families when perhaps a rational choice would have been to spend this money on weapons of war. After all, they were engaged in a global conflict. And so that made it even more difficult for them to prioritize spending on armaments, tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. Nazi ideology also posed problems for the Germans when it came to generating labor. When the war began, there was a desperate need across the Third Reich for workers for the factories to make tanks, to make aircraft, to make ammunition, given that millions of German men were mobilized for the front in uniform and unable to work. And so an obvious place to turn to was German women who were homemakers, who were unemployed, who were taking care of families, but even those whose families were out of the house. Hitler was very reluctant to do so. He argued, and the Nazis argued, that women should be at home, in church, in the kitchen, taking care of their children, not making ammunition in the factories. And so for several years, really until almost the war was over, the Nazis refused to mobilize women on the scale as was seen in the United States. You may remember Rosie the Riveter in the UK and in other countries, especially in the Soviet Union, where women were mobilized at even higher rates than men. The Germans also expelled many of their own citizens. In the 1930s, tens of thousands of German Jews were expelled from the country, forced to move overseas with their assets confiscated. The Germans also expelled Poles, Sinti and Roma, who were often more commonly referred to as gypsies. So they drove out labor from Germany. And just to give you one example, if you think about the U.S. nuclear weapons program, atomic weapons program during World War II, a significant percentage of those involved were German Jews who had been expelled, taking their expertise and their knowledge to support the Allies as opposed to their country of birth. And then finally, one thing to keep in mind is that in Germany during the Third Reich, free unions were banned. So the previous socialist, liberal, Marxist unions that had organized workers in the 1920s and 30s that were very wide scale were abolished in the once the Nazis took power. And instead of free unions who could negotiate with their employers and argue for better conditions, better wages, there was a single movement, the DAF, the Deutsche Arbeitsfront, the German Labor Front, which is essentially a government union, but it did not negotiate on behalf of workers. Instead, it managed their expectations, kept them in line, and made sure they complied with orders from managers and owners. The Deutsche Arbeitsfront, you can see a poster here with the swastika in it, did provide leisure activities and provided some educational chances for workers and tried to support their morale, but it was not the same as a union that was an advocate for them. When Germany began to bring foreign workers in during the Third Reich, the DAF, the Deutsche Arbeitsfront, was the structure under which they were all supervised. So whether they were, as we'll talk about, Poles, French, Spanish, Italians, and so on, it was the DAF that was over them in making sure they carried out expectations of their employers. So I mentioned the war begins, at least in terms of combat, in Poland, with a very quick Nazi victory over the Poles. And very quick, just within a few months, the Germans begin to impose work expectations and requirements on the Poles. You can see on the map what happens to Poland under German occupation. Initially, they absorbed much of Western Poland into German territory, so arguing this is now Germany, and they force all the Poles in those territories to move into what is called the general government. They won't even call it Poland anymore. Instead, they call it the general government, just to diminish the hope that the Poles have of ever being an independent country again. So the general government is essentially a dumping ground for Poles expelled from the West. It is a place where every Polish man, every Polish woman, in fact, every Pole above the age of 14 have to register for work. If they're not going to be engaged actively in agricultural labor or in have a gainful employment in the general government, they have to sign up to be sent to the Third Reich to work for Germany. During World War II, over 3 million Poles are forced to move to Germany to work in German factories. Of course, really, you could argue that all Poles were working for Germany, whether they were in the Third Reich or in the general government. There is, during the course of the war, massive killings of Poles, not only through execution of those who are educated, anyone who could potentially be a leader in Poland, whether a priest or a college professor, a teacher, a local official, anyone with an education in Poland was summarily executed because the idea was that Poles would be a permanent underclass to the Germans. Additionally, Polish Jews were executed, well over 90% of them by the end of the war, whether machine gunned, killed on the Eastern Front in trench lines, or sent to the death camps throughout the Third Reich. You can see the Polish deaths are essentially split between Jews and Catholics, but of course this number represents about 10% of Polish Catholics, but about 90% of Polish Jews. In the West, France falls the year after Poland in 1940 and is divided in two. Coastal and northern France is directly occupied. The remainder of central and southern France is established as a collaborationist regime, essentially a puppet state of the Nazis, Vichy France. In 1942, as the Allies land in North Africa, the Germans occupy all of France. The entire rest of the country comes under their control. With the fall of France in 1940, the Germans captured over 1 million French soldiers and kept them as prisoners of war. But they cut a deal with Vichy France, that's the collaborationist state, that for every 3 French civilians who signed up to work in Germany, they would release 1 French prisoner of war. And so it's kind of a form of moral extortion. Like, if you love your French soldiers, you should come and work in Germany. That will help them, help you through this scheme. Over the course of the war, over 600,000 French civilians did come to work in Germany. Some of them initially on a volunteer basis because there was mass unemployment in France, very few ways to earn a living. Others were essentially conscripted. The police would come to the local town and say, you have a choice. You can go to work in Germany or you can go to jail. It's completely up to you, your free choice. You can imagine which way most French agreed. And even though some French prisoners of war were released, over 600,000 remained in German custody, interned throughout the war, and were forced to work in German industry, on German farms throughout the Third Reich. Got a map here that shows that division of France from the occupation until 1942, and again in 1942, all of France is occupied by the Nazis. Now, Nazi Germany did have allies in Europe, among them Italy, Hungary, Finland, Romania, Bulgaria, and so on, countries that more or less voluntarily agreed to support the German war effort, to send forces to fight alongside the Germans, and in most cases to send workers voluntarily to labor in German factories. Workers coming from these collaborationist states, again, from allies that joined the Axis, were treated better when they came to Nazi Germany. In most cases, their governments signed agreements by which the Germans promised to treat them equally with Germans. Same pay, same conditions, same status in society, same ability to travel, and so on. In practice, that tended not to be the case. Then once they arrived in Germany, they were segregated in worker camps as opposed to being allowed to live freely throughout Germany. They were subject to discrimination. They were much more likely to be picked up and arrested for minor offenses like jaywalking and so on, or just being in the wrong place at the wrong time and being obviously not German. But nonetheless, all of the states that allied with Germany did send workers. The largest by far was Italy. Now, as with Poland, Italy had a long tradition of sending workers to Germany, typically seasonal workers, to bring in the harvest, to plant in the spring, and then return to Italy. And so, especially in northern Italy, there was a custom of going to Germany for a season and coming back. But Mussolini signed multiple agreements in the 1930s to send even more. Again, the German war effort was desperate for labor. The Italian economy was nowhere near as strong as that of Germany's. And of course, Italy had nowhere near the size of armaments production as Germany did. And so many of the Italian army units were outfitted with German equipment. So it made perfect sense to send Italians. They would also be able to send money back to Italy and help the Italian economy. So by 1941, the high point of Italian and German collaboration, there are almost 250,000 Italians working officially in Germany, with tens of thousands more working unofficially, without official government sponsorship, but nonetheless employed in the German economy. You may know that Italy did not fight quite as well as Germany during the Second World War. In fact, in almost every situation, they had to be rescued by the German military. They invaded Albania and almost got beat. They invaded Greece, and at one point there was a joke, the best way to see Rome is to join the Greek army. And this came to the most embarrassing point in 1943 when Italy was actually defeated by the Allies. That the Allies landed in Sicily and southern Italy. Mussolini was overthrown by his own hand-picked fascist Grand Council, was imprisoned, a great humiliation for someone who saw himself as Hitler's equal and someone who would jointly rule the world. So Italy surrendered to the Allies. About 1 million Italians surrendered to the Allies. Another 1 million were captured by the Germans. In northern and central Italy, the Germans forced the Italians to turn over their weapons. They arrested them all, interned them in camps. Many of them were deported to Germany, essentially to be imprisoned. The Italian workers who were already in Germany immediately lost their privileged status. I mentioned that the workers from countries allied to Germany had a little better conditions. They immediately became on the same level as those from Poland or Eastern Europe. Restricted to camps, paid less or nothing at all, essentially became overnight from allies to prisoners. The same thing for the Italian soldiers who were captured by the Germans. There was kind of an ambiguous situation, though, because Mussolini was rescued by Nazi commandos, propped up on a satellite state in northern Italy. And so the Germans weren't sure. Are the Italians our allies again, or are they still prisoners? What do we do? They ended up being in this uncertain situation for the rest of the war. Italian workers who had been in Germany already treated a little better. Italian soldiers who had been captured after surrendering, not treated so well. Thousands died by the end of the war. this ambiguous situation kind of continues to the end of the conflict. That picture in the bottom are Italians volunteering to go to Germany in the good old days when Italy was an independent country before the Allies invaded. Another state, and this is the government, or this is the country that I'm writing my book about now, is Spain. Spain was neutral, but early in the war enthusiastically pro-Axis, pro-Nazi. Francisco Franco would come to power through help from Hitler and Mussolini, and although he didn't enter the war, he was very favorably disposed toward the Axis, hoped they would win, hated the Soviet Union that had helped the other side in the Spanish Civil War, also was not a fan of the British or the Americans, although he eventually came to a deal with them. So he's grateful to the Germans. He's also a little bit scared of the Germans, and so in 1941 he does two things. He sends a division of Spanish soldiers to fight on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union, called the División Azul, or the Blue Division. But relevant today, he also agrees to send workers to Nazi Germany, volunteer workers. There's a deal signed between these two gentlemen, Gerardo Salvador Marino on your left, my right, and Robert Ley. You can know he's a German because he has a swastika on his arm. They signed an agreement in the spring of 41, that's before the invasion of the Soviet Union, to send 100,000 Spanish workers to Germany. And again, they will be supervised once they get there by the Deutsche Arbeitsfront, the DAF, the German Labor Front, of which Robert Ley is the leader. Of course, between the time of the agreement, April of 41, and when that actually gets started, Germany invades the Soviet Union. So there's a huge wave of enthusiasm in Spain to repay the Soviet Union for the destruction it had caused in the Spanish Civil War, but most of that enthusiasm is captured in volunteers for the Blue Division. This is the unit that will be in the German army, Spanish volunteers in the Eastern Front. Recruitment for the workers is delayed a little bit. Everyone's focused on the army, focused on this unit that will, of course, march to Moscow for the victory parade, which is what they expect. And so they get a little behind on mobilizing workers. By the time they start in September, October 41, those who are really on fire for the Nazis had already joined the army and were headed for the Eastern Front. And so the initial plan to get 100,000 doesn't quite come to fruition. About 25,000 Spanish workers do go to the offices volunteering to go to Germany. But it takes a long time. The Germans insist on medical exams. They have extensive interviews. It takes weeks and weeks and weeks. And by the time they actually get to it, they only have about 4,000 left who are considered fit by both sides, able to go, and willing to sign the contracts. So about 4% of what they initially expect will happen. They go to Germany in the fall of 41. There's a lot of effort put around to organize these train loads of Spanish workers. The Germans prepare for them. They even start publishing newspapers in Spanish. So at least there's a good start, even though the numbers are pretty small. This program continues for a couple of years actively. The Spanish workers arrive in late 41. And you may not know much, but you probably know that it's a lot colder in Germany than it is in Spain. And so when they get off the trains and snow is everywhere and they don't have warm clothes, it's a pretty miserable experience. Also, unlike the promises they received to be treated like Germans, they're put into barracks with lots of other foreign workers. The food is terrible. I mean, it's German food, so, they're not used to sauerkraut and sausages and the soft bread that the Germans give them. They're pretty upset about this. They want paella and lentils and salad and seafood. It's a great disappointment to them. They also often experience broken contracts. So they might sign up to be a skilled metallurgy worker in Spain, and by the time they get to Germany, they suddenly become an unskilled agricultural laborer. So they're going to be paid much less. They're going to be treated more poorly with harsher conditions. And of course, this is, after all, Nazi Germany. When a Spanish worker walks down the street in Berlin, he might be treated badly. He might be arrested by the Gestapo. Certainly, if he decides to flirt with a German girl, he might be beat up by Germans. So it's a pretty unhappy experience to begin with. The two governments, the Spanish and German governments, try a couple of times to revive the program. In the spring of 42, they put some better conditions in place. some additional protections for Spanish workers. They recruit some more. In fact, by mid-42, the program rises to its largest number, 9,500. Again, that's less than 10% of the original plan. It's certainly disappointing to both sides. But nonetheless, it does rise up. Again, in the spring of 43, again, there's an attempt to recruit more Spanish workers. A few thousand more are sent, but the numbers never rise much beyond this. In fact, you can see the decline in numbers. What also begins to be a problem in late 1942 and early 43 is that the war begins to go in a different direction. You may have heard of the Battle of Stalingrad, which I'll mention a little bit. But at the same time, and affecting Spanish workers in Germany, is Allied air raids begin in a pretty accelerated way. The British, the Americans begin bombing, first sporadically, then consistently, then it begins to be almost every day. And so for Spanish workers who are in barracks, who don't have access to air raid shelters and bunkers, it's a pretty terrifying situation. And what it may have seemed like a good idea in 1941, when Germany was on the cusp of winning the war, by 1943, perhaps is a time for regrets. The Spanish workers signed contracts for 2 years. That's the agreement. And so by 1943, everyone who was in that initial round, their contracts are up. And even before then, many of them who had been able to go home on leave decide not to come back. So the numbers decline pretty precipitously, you can see there. The Germans were also inconsistent in allowing the Spanish workers to have the privileges they'd been promised. They arbitrarily denied them vacations. They canceled scheduled outings they were supposed to provide. It became a pretty challenging situation. You can see here, this is actually from a football game in April of 42, in which the sports palace in Germany, the same place that held the Olympics, was filled to the rafters with Spanish and German workers and soldiers watching a friendly game between Spain and Germany. With the acceleration of the air raids, big public events like this began no longer to be possible or safe because the Allies would get wind of it and drop bombs on the game. So even the entertainment and the leisure activities began to be curtailed in 43. The vast majority of workers in Germany were forced workers from Eastern Europe, not conscripts from France, not volunteers from Spain and Italy, but forced labor. The Russians and Ukrainians made up the bulk of these for obvious reasons. After 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union and took under its control over 50 million, then 80 million Soviet citizens, mostly Russians and Ukrainians. They were at the lowest level of conditions. They were treated poorly. They were kept the most restricted of any workers. In fact, the Germans were relatively indifferent whether they lived or died, paid them little or nothing at all, gave them the poorest food, the poorest housing, certainly of all foreign workers in Germany. They had to wear a badge or a band that says Ost, which means East, representing Eastern workers, similar to the yellow star that Jews had to wear, and only Jews were treated worse than the Eastern workers initially. I would put aside from this category of Eastern workers the Jews, because even though they were treated badly, the Germans at least were willing to let the Eastern workers live, give them enough food for them to keep working and to stay contributing to the German military production, agricultural production. With the Jews, there was never any proposal or plan to keep them alive. There were temporary pauses in their extermination. Camps, factories could employ them for brief periods of time, a few weeks, a few months. You may have seen the movie Schindler's List. Certainly that's a rare exception. In most cases, the plan that the Nazis had for the Jews was unaltered, and that was to exterminate them as soon as possible by whatever means necessary in every location where they lived. Residents from the Baltic regions, the Baltic states, even though they had been in the Soviet Union, in fact, the Germans had given the Baltic states to Stalin as part of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, they were treated a little better. They were considered sort of in between the Ost and the Europeans, semi-civilized by the Germans' terms, even semi-German. There were a number of there had been German settlements in the Baltic states. There had been some mixing of populations, and so that should say semi-German, not sem-German. Sorry about the typo. So if you were from one of the Baltic states, you could come to Germany. You could have relative freedom, a little better situation certainly than Russians or Poles. And in fact, when the Soviet Union began to drive the Germans out of Eastern Europe, many residents of the Baltic states preferred to leave with the Germans rather than wait for the Soviet Union to arrive, realizing that they would be treated even worse by the communists than by the Nazis. So all Eastern workers, but definitely different conditions and treatment for these three major categories. In late 1942, the Nazis realized that victory was not imminent, that their blitzkrieg victories in 1939, 1940, 1941 had not led to a triumph, but that instead, especially after the failure of their summer 42 offensive in the Soviet Union, that the war was likely to last a long time. They also began to just do some basic math and realized that they were killing their workers faster than they were gaining new ones. And so they were essentially eliminating their own supply that provided productivity, that enabled them to continue the war effort. And so not out of any sense of mercy or humanitarianism, but out of necessity, they came to the conclusion that we're working our employees to death, and eventually there'll be none left. So we need to reverse course. So beginning in late 42, but especially 1943, the Nazis began to pitch the war differently and to behave differently toward especially the Eastern workers, the Ostarbeiter that I mentioned, but really it accrued to the benefit of all the workers that were in Germany at the time, including those from collaborationist states like Vichy France, those from Allied states like Italy and Spain. And so the Germans began to say, this is not a war for Nazism, this is not a war for Hitler, this is a war for all of Europe. We're all in this together. We're all on the same team. Our enemies are the communists and the Anglo-Saxons, but if you're Dutch, if you're Italian, if you're Hungarian, even if you're Polish or Russian, you're all on the Nazi team. You can imagine how this message was received, but the Germans did put practical changes behind it. They began to provide more food, enough to sustain life. They began to improve housing. They began to provide a way for even Polish and Russian workers to complain about conditions without being shot. They began to make things better in a measurable way across the board for foreign workers in the Third Reich, the people making the tanks, making the aircraft, making the ammunition upon which the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS and other forces of Hitler relied. And amazingly, they found that if you feed workers, they work harder. If you let them sleep under a roof as opposed to outdoors, they're more efficient. If you don't shoot them when they complain, sometimes they have good ideas about making things better. So over 1943 and into 1944, the productivity of foreign workers increased dramatically. And in fact, if you look at the production of tanks, aircraft, ammunition in Germany in 1943 and 44, it accelerates dramatically, even as Germany is losing territory. And it's largely due to this change in a policy toward foreign workers. Again, not out of any compassion, not out of the real sense of collaboration and fellowship, but really out of the necessities of war. The Nazis convinced Hitler, we have to do this. We'll kill them eventually, but for now we have to keep them all alive, producing for us so we can win the war. And you can see this poster. It says, Europe works in Germany. And Sauckel, that's the leader of the German labor office that manages these workers, mobilizes the last reserves, or the reserves for Germany. You can see a happy foreign worker. He's, seems to be well fed, and certainly he's working hard. He's not filthy, right? So these are changes in their treatment. 1943 and 44, despite the increased production, despite better conditions for workers, goes badly for Germany. And Foreign workers began to see this on an almost daily basis with massive air raids. And even though the Germans began to provide bunkers and air raid shelters, they could not hide the destruction of factories and housing through Allied air raids, firebombing, ongoing attacks. In fact, in 1943, in something that brought clear to Spain the results of their choice, the Spanish embassy was leveled by a British air raid, completely leveled. And that begins, 1943, Spain reconsidering its affiliation with Germany. In fact, beginning in 43, they decide not to send any more workers, and they begin to repatriate them home, leading to the numbers that I showed earlier, which dramatic decrease. Not all European states have the same capacity, though. But by the summer of 44, it's very clear which way this conflict is going. The Soviets are making progress in the east, and of course the Allies land in France. Of course, 90% of the fighting is taking place in the Eastern Front. That's where the war is going to be decided. But the conflict now being a two-front war, it's hard not to see which way it's going to go. As the war begins to end, the messages by the DAF to foreign workers is very clear. It's Hitler or Stalin. You have a choice. You know what Stalin will bring: death, destruction, occupation, communism. At least here, you're on the team. At least here, we're doing our best to work together. And so there is productivity continues until really the end of the war. In some measures, it's really remarkable. The last few months, the Germans are producing more military hardware than earlier in the conflict, despite the reduction in Nazi territory, despite all the supply and logistical problems from the air raids. It's really a remarkable story of productivity. And again, it's the foreign workers who are achieving it. The Nazis are never able to resolve their shortages of labor. Even as in the last year of the war, they finally agree that German women should be mobilized, even as they begin to provide more housing, better food for foreign workers. They never have enough workers. They're never efficient enough at mobilizing resources. Even to the end of the war, they're spending money on consumer goods, on clothing, civilian clothing, all these things that are diversion from the war effort. And as I mentioned, the mass murder by the Nazis seriously undermines the effectiveness of their war effort. Some historians and people after the war have said, well, if the Nazis would have only not killed the Jews, they could have won the war. If the Nazis would have only not killed Soviet prisoners of war, they could have won the war. That was the point of the war. The main goal of Hitler was to make Germany and all of Europe free of the Jews, to do by whatever means necessary, to expel them, to kill them, to exterminate the Jews. And so for him to not do that, he would not be Hitler. He would not be Nazi. He would not have those values that had brought him to power in the first place. The same thing with the treatment of non-Germans. Even though there are some modifications to the policy of starvation and forced labor and conscription, even though they make things a little better out of necessity, the Nazis never genuinely believed that Poles, Russians, even Italians and Spaniards were equal to them. It was a temporary accommodation to win the war. But there were multiple accounts in memos and meetings of Nazis saying, we'll deal with them after the war. In other words, this is a temporary pause, a temporary truce, until we defeat the Soviets and the British and the Americans, and then we'll get back to reordering Europe according to our racial view, with Germans at the top and everyone else below, if not exterminated. Even with the slightly better conditions, foreign workers suffered disproportionately, and you could argue that it's not just those forced to move to Germany or who volunteered to move to Germany to work to save their families. Really, all of Europe was under German control and in a situation of forced labor. Does it really make a difference if you're a Pole working in the general government in Poland or in Prussia? You're still growing crops for the Germans. You're still not getting enough to feed your family. You're still subordinate to them and can be killed at any time for the most minor of offenses. If you're a French civilian working in Paris, running the metro for German soldiers, does that really substantially different from a French civilian working in Germany, making ammunition? You're still serving the Germans. They're still the lords of Europe, and everyone else is second or third citizens if allowed to live at all. And even those who were most enthusiastic about Nazi Germany, who embraced the vision, who agreed that this was a good thing, who were allies all the way to the end, the war ended just as badly for them as it did for the Germans. In fact, arguably even more so, with disproportionate losses among those states and armies that were allied to the Germans. And at this point, I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you for listening to me.
Questions from the audience.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting. I'd like, if you could address, I mean, this could take hours discussing this, you had limited time, but I'd like, if you can, to address the irony of the fact that at the beginning of 1945, some 3 or 4 months before the war actually ended, in May of 45, the irony of Jews who had been taken to the east effectively to get them out of Germany and had been exterminated. Some, of course, had survived the war by maybe being incarcerated as the war was coming to an end. If you could address the issue of the forced marches from the concentration camps in the beginning of 1945, and how did the Germans react to the fact that Jews who had been expelled now all of a sudden are being brought back to Germany to serve as forced laborers in the last few months of the war?
Yeah, it's a horrifying episode for sure. That as the Red Army begins to advance in the east, the Germans, to the extent that they cannot exterminate the Jews, they begin to evacuate them to the west. In some cases, they set aside specific populations, especially skilled ones, with the plan to evacuate them. With no mercy on the march. I mean, so if you hesitated, if you stumbled, I mean, you're very likely to get a bullet to the back of the head. But yes, the Germans at this point were desperate on 2 counts. They don't want the Soviet Union to capture any of the camps intact, because they realize what they've done will be used by Allied propaganda. They're not ashamed of it, but they're concerned that it might be pointed out as criminal actions. They also are desperate to keep whatever labor they can in those last few months, given that much of Germany has already been occupied. Certainly, Western Europe has been liberated. So yeah, it's and then they're brought to work sites and factories and so on. But of course, many of these marches end up going nowhere. They're planned to go to a certain location. That factory is overrun. They're diverted to another location. That area is overrun. So many of these marches end up going nowhere. And as the war begins to come to the end, in some cases, the Jews and others who have been forced to march would wake up and find their German captors gone. They've run off to take care of themselves, and they're left to their own devices, starving, staggering through Germany as the war is coming to an end. So, yeah, I'm certainly not an expert on this, but it's one in a long series of awful, horrible things that happened at the end of the war. Great question, though.
Many decades ago, I read Speer's autobiography. Does he mention this change of policy that you mentioned in 43 to try and improve the productivity?
Albert Speer, who was Hitler's architect and becomes Minister of Armaments during the war, is a very interesting historical figure, because he wrote an autobiography which basically says, I did my best. It wasn't really my fault. It was, the fault of all the other Nazi leaders. Historians have dug into the actual record and found, no, actually Speer was in some ways just as bad as the others, that he knowingly used forced labor, knowingly made conditions worse, knowing, all these things. He certainly was one of the more efficient leaders within Nazi Germany, and plays a large part in this increase in productivity I mentioned. He's also very practical. So I think he agreed with the Nazi leaders who said, let's feed him more. Let's give him better conditions. It might work. Again, not out of any humanitarian concern. Yeah, it's I think the historian is Deborah Lipschitz, who wrote a pretty clear expose of all of Speer's obfuscations and lies, but intriguing character for sure. And if all Nazi officials had been as efficient and effective as Speer, they might have won the war. Fortunately, a lot of them were like Ley and Selkel and not really so effective. Yeah, good question.
A question here.
I got a question. I went to the movies, and George Papard won the war and so forth. But he was in a movie where they sent him over to sabotage, and he was a conscripted laborer, and he wound up blowing up the whole Nazi rocket program. But really, were some of the, especially in the occupied countries, was there effective resistance and undermining of the work?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, a lot of the civilians, like the French civilians, Italians who went to Germany, they realized that the Germans knew where their families were, since after all, they were sending money home on a monthly basis. And so there's relatively few examples of sabotage in the workplace. After 43, when in France they begin to conscript people, forcing them to go to Germany, there begins to be an actual French resistance, and accelerates at the end of the year and beginning into 44. Yugoslavia is another place where there's active resistance against German occupation. Yugoslavia, much of it is mountainous, so it's much easier to hide and so on.